Well, hello and welcome everyone to this episode of Apology Accepted here at Spirit of Truth Outreach on the moral argument, moral facts. Now, as we get into this is our second chapter or second unit on this, second lesson, and we're going through the Baggett's book, The Morals of the Story. It's been a ton of fun so far, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today, or at least the conversation. Now, for those who watch some of the other talks that I do, you'll probably see that this one's a little bit different. This might be a little bit more conversational. There might be a little bit more thinking on the fly. And that's because this type of information, philosophy in general, merits thinking on the fly. It merits pondering even as we're speaking, pondering and thinking new thoughts. So I'm really excited to kind of dip into this. And again, today we're going to be talking about stubborn moral facts, or in other words, the objective reality of morality in our lives. So let's go ahead and get it started. Okay, so one issue that we have when dealing with morality, and it's something like morality, gravity kind of works like this, air for that matter, even consciousness. Okay, Rationale points this out that the Baggett's point this out that the more omnipresent a reality, the more pervasive a reality is, the easier it is to go unnoticed, or it is to be taken for granted. And so essentially, right, we don't think about the air we breathe throughout most of the day. We don't think about a lot of the things that we just simply take for granted. There's water coming out of our sink, the electricity is on when we turn on the lights. We don't necessarily think about that. And the funny thing is the same is true for morality. That there is an objective moral standard. That murder is wrong, that stealing is wrong, and that generally people simply agree on this. And then beyond that, to some of these moral facts we'll talk about, that those things are just simply true. We often take it for granted. Now, Hastings Rationale had this to say, and I love this quote, so go ahead and key in on this. I'll read it slow. So long as he is content to assume the reality and authority of the moral consciousness, the moral philosopher can ignore metaphysics. But if the reality of morals or the validity of ethical truth be once brought into question, the attack can only be met by a thoroughgoing inquiry into the nature of knowledge and reality. In other words, most people are going to essentially assume this reality, that morality is real, it's subjective, and that there are consequences, or consciousness. In other words, that we're aware of it, of morality, and there's authority behind it. But the second we question those things, we now have to get into the knowledge, or the nature of knowledge and reality. We have to get into metaphysics and epistemology. The second that you question those things. Okay, and what we're essentially going to do in this is we're going to identify a number of moral facts, and we're going to talk about these facts tonight, get you used to them, and then in later sessions we're actually going to get into them a little bit more, that are part of our reality. They're part of the fabric of this world that we live in. And then we're going to ask essentially what can best explain for them. This is called the inference to best explanation, or abduction. What is the best explanation? And we're really going after two things. First, we're going after explanatory power. And this is how well a worldview explains these facts. And then we're going to be talking about explanatory scope. And that deals with how much does it explain? Does it explain all of what we see, or just part of it? And essentially, what I'm going to be going for here, as the Baggetts do as well, is that God's existence is likely true. And I say that from simply an argument perspective, right? That's what we're going for. We're going to try to demonstrate that that theism, Christian theism, is the best explanation for these moral facts that we see. So what are some of these moral facts? Well, first we have things called values and obligations. Now, the first major moral fact we have to deal with is that human beings have value. Okay? Now, what's fascinating is it's only in recent history that this was assumed to be a foundational principle. Okay, worldwide anyway, or nearly worldwide. And in fact, there's still many countries where this is actually denied, oddly enough. And it's anywhere where you see the society is worth more than the individual, That's a negation of human value. So let's talk about this human value for a moment. Okay, well, human value, you can see it best in this idea of a capital crime of murder. When I step on an ant, nothing happens. If I were to go and kill somebody, I would be brought up on charges, and my life itself could be forfeit. Okay, I would either go to jail for the rest of my life, or I could be given the death penalty. Now, why is that? Because there's something about a human life that has value. And in fact, it has so much value that only really, that the only real recompense or payment for it is the life of another human being. That there's nothing that quite ever makes up for it. No amount of money could replace it. No amount of goods and services could replace it. No, nothing quite adds up to the life of a single human. And in fact, no matter how the quality of that human's life, could be a homeless person on the street that gets murdered. It doesn't matter. Could be a person who's deformed. It doesn't matter. A murder is a murder is a murder. And nothing, no amount of money, no amount of material things, no amount of repayment ever matches up to that life. The only time people are satisfied with this is when the person has to then spend the rest of their life in prison or the death penalty. And that's because of a recognition of something called the intrinsic human value. Now the question's going to come up. Why are humans valuable? And this is a harder answer for the secularist than you'd normally think. Because you see, on one hand, the secularists could say, well, human beings are valuable. Okay, well, you affirmed it, but you haven't defended it. You haven't given a foundational reason for it. Well, human beings are valuable because I'm a human being and I value myself. Well, that's all well and good for you to value yourself, but that doesn't mean that you are actually valuable, that if somebody kills you, that they should be tried for murder and potentially lose their own life. That doesn't defend that. I mean, you might have a very high opinion of yourself, but you could actually, in reality, be worth no more than the dust on the earth. Or as my biology professor said, you're just a big bag of enzymes. Well, if that's the case, then what is murder? It's really nothing. You're just spreading a big bag of enzymes back into the ground. There's nothing really wrong about that. Well, society determines it. That's interesting. Because society tends to place different value on different people's lives. You've got the unborn child has a different value. You've got the senile person has a different value. You've got the working person has a different value. You've got the homeless person. Society seems to treat all these different people differently. They don't seem to give them intrinsic value. So that doesn't make sense. And societies throughout history have devalued human beings left, right, and center. Genocides, for example, devalue people all the time. So that doesn't really seem to be a good foundation for it either. And then even if that's the case, that's just subjective. It doesn't mean you're actually worth anything. It just means that people say you are. So that could evaporate tomorrow if the wrong people got in power. So intrinsically, why? Why are human beings worth something? It's very hard for a secularist to answer this question at a foundational, objective level. Okay, the Christian worldview has an easy answer. The Christian worldview simply says you're made in the image of God. You're the only being that's made in the image of God. You are the created being that has the highest value because you are made in God's very own image. You're an image bearer. There's your intrinsic value. There's your source of it right there, God himself. Now, the second type of fact that comes up is this idea of moral obligation. You see, there's a feeling people have called guilt when they fail to perform actions they know they should, or when they do things they shouldn't do and are censored for it, or censured for it. That's moral obligation. You have an obligation, to censor someone for neglecting it. In other words, you have an obligation to do certain things. Even though it's not technically wrong not to do it, you still feel guilty for failing to perform it. There is this moral obligation. They do exist. They do exist. Supererogatory acts. Going above and beyond what is technically just good or required, sometimes that's the case. For example, if we're walking by a person on the street who's bleeding out on the street, and we just keep going, we don't even call 911, do we have to call 911? No. But I don't think anybody would say that guy was doing the right thing when he walked by and didn't help the guy who was bleeding and dying on the street. There are moral obligations that we seem to have ingrained. Now, someone could say, well, it's just evolution. No, but it's not just evolution, because here's the problem with saying it's just evolution. The comment is that it's wrong. Not that I feel that it's wrong, but that it is wrong. If I feel that it's wrong, then who cares? That's just my thought. It is actually wrong. That's what we want to say. We want to say it is actually wrong that they ignored the welfare of another human being. And again, the question is, well, okay, so evolution, yeah, I mean, that no, it doesn't. Because again, evolution creates a sense of obligation, maybe, but it doesn't actually create an actual obligation. So it doesn't actually deal with the reality of it being a real moral obligation. And there's 2 points on this. The first point is it's actually wrong not to act. Now, the problem is it's not breaking any rule. Well, it's not breaking any negation rule. In other words, don't steal, don't do any of these things. Is there a rule maybe from Scripture that it could be breaking? Yeah, love your neighbor as yourself. It's breaking that rule. Again, we're not treating somebody as an image bearer. Thus, it's wrong. So, moral obligations. There's also the fact that these sort of binding authoritative obligations exist seem to be real. And we need to be able to explain it. Okay? Now, you can deny these. Okay, you can deny this kind of stuff. You can be a moral skeptic, right? You could. But that doesn't seem to be the world which we live in. So if you're going to be a skeptic on these things, you just have to understand that you're arguing we live in a non-reality. You're arguing we live in some fictional world. Because the real world seems to play these things out. Now, what about the third moral fact? Well, moral freedom. So what's moral freedom? Well, some people would argue that human beings can determine what's good and bad, right or wrong, virtue or vice, or at least that they have access to this. Some people deny that we can even do that. Some say that to be human is to be a meaningful moral agent. And some say, morality is prescriptive. It tells us how we ought to live. Thus, it only makes sense if we have sufficient volitional control. In other words, it seems like our decision-making capabilities are real, important, and we're justified either in doing right or doing wrong, or not justified. We can be supported if we did right, and we can be judged if we did wrong. Moral freedom is a real thing. There's some people who deny it. There's some people say, no, it's all hard determinism. The problem is, if everything truly is hard determinism, there's no justice system. There's no need for it. It's just a number of bad inputs got into a person that caused a bad outcome. Or something just broke in their biological system that caused these things to happen. And that stinks, but it's not, I don't like it, but it's not wrong, it's not evil, because one, there's no evil act in hard determinism. You can't say that anyone did anything for any reason. Remember, one of the key tenets of our justice system is motive. And in this case, there'd be no motives because it's all hard determinism. There was no decision-making involved. Okay, at least on a higher level. There was decision-making in terms of a biological thing, but beyond that, no. So it does seem that we have moral freedom. It does seem that we can be held accountable for our actions. So how do we account for that? We can't just be all biology and account for true moral freedom. It doesn't work. There's got to be something acting on the matter. Again, secularists have a hard time. Materialists have a hard time with this. Theists, Christians, simple. We have a soul. God created us the soul, a non-physical part of our being that can interact with the physical parts. And finally, next we have moral knowledge. In other words, we have an idea of what right and wrong is. Remember, you might think, oh, that's simple, but no, actually, it's not. To the secularist, an objective, by the way, objective right or wrong, objective moral knowledge, there's 2 parts to it. One, that there is such a thing as objective morality, and 2, that we have access to it and can know it, and do know it, to some extent. The secularist then has to come up with 2 things. One, where does this objective morality come from? And 2, how do we have access to it? Because you see, if they deny that there is an objective morality, then we don't really have moral knowledge. We don't actually have justified true belief. We cannot know if it's true or false. And well, actually, in fact, it is neither true nor false, so it's neither of those. Okay, so that's the issue. Is if there is no such objective morality, then we don't have knowledge because we cannot demonstrate that those thoughts are actually true. However, it's the same thing. If they do believe there's an objective morality, which some actually will argue, but they just say we don't have access to it, we're just trying to strive for it, the comment would be, well, again, if we don't have any access to it, then all we're doing is just shooting in the dark. We're just simply trying the best that we can, but we don't even know what the target is. So again, either way you cut it, explaining moral knowledge is very difficult for the secular materialist. Christian can simply say that moral knowledge is based on the nature and character of God. It's what he commands humans to do, again, based on his nature and character. And we know it because 1, he's written it on our hearts, and 2, he's given it to us in word format. Very easy explanation for the origin of these things. Okay, and again, we're just doing surface level discussion here, surface level. We're going to dive into each of these over the course of a single session in the future. There's also something called moral transformation, which is how do we get better? Again, the problem with the secularist is they don't have a target to get better toward. And then secondarily, the entire history of human history, or the entire span of human history, shows that people haven't been getting better on the whole. And so we have a serious problem with moral transformation. How do you actually do it? Again, Christianity would simply say God has to physically, spiritually change you, and then he's going to sanctify you. Now, I want to talk now about essentially something called Kantian moral faith, because this is going to kind of be something that's going to come up over and over in our discussions. Okay, so here's a thought from C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis argued that there were 2 facts at the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in, and we live in a certain way and can't really get rid of it. Okay, and second, they do not in fact behave in that way. They know the law of nature, and they break it. Okay, so there's this interesting situation that we have. Kantian moral faith. What is it? Well, he's going to argue that the moral life is possible. This is Immanuel Kant. Moral life is possible. And that a life of true happiness must be a moral life. That morality and happiness must converge. Okay? So that's sort of the argument. The moral life is possible, and morality and happiness must converge. Now, the question then comes up, well, is morality possible? Is moral transformation possible? What resources do we need? The problem is we seem to need really strong external resources to meet this moral demand and to affect the needed change in our own character. In other words, it doesn't seem like we can do it ourselves. Kant even argued that the moral demand is high. There's a very high moral demand in terms of perfection, and we have a natural inclination to resist it. He even argued, in a sense, for some sort of indwelling sin that we need to, even though, Kant had some very odd ideas about religion, but, he argued that we are naturally inclined to resist it. And so the thought is, well, if we're able to be virtuous, completely altruistic and self-controlled, wouldn't that mean a life of essentially asceticism? And this is sort of one of the hard things. It's like, how do you get to this issue of happy and also moral? Where do those 2 converge? Okay, and so these are some of the questions that we're going to be dealing with as we go throughout the next couple of talks. We're going to be dealing with the phenomenon of evil. We're going to be dealing with moral agency, moral goodness, moral obligations, moral transformation, moral rationality or knowledge. We're going to be hitting on all of these things to some extent. And now I'd like to go ahead and just spend a little bit of time, those are my main notes, but I'd like to spend a little bit of time just pontificating with you for a moment about why this is important. At this juncture in society, we have a large group of people arguing that morality is what they say it is. And they're very good at doing this. They're very good at saying, this is what is good and this is what is evil, and you have to follow it. You're not allowed to question it. You simply have to accept and live as we tell you to live. And that could change day to day. That could change tomorrow. They could say, well, nope, now you have to do this. Now this is good. Okay. And the problem with this is that this is very easy to fall into the sway of this, to be swayed by this type of thinking. Because when you're told from authority sources what is good and evil, and then you're presented with an emotional reason for it, even potentially false reasons for it, it's very easy to fall under the sway of these things. And so the only way to fight that is to really understand the true source of our morality and how we understand moral facts and knowledge and how we relate to them, and how we actually become better people. For example, there's something called social justice theory out there right now. And in this, the gospel of reconciliation. And so what the comment behind it is simply this. The comment behind it is simply that there's been these systemic racial issues that have occurred between people, and now we're in a situation where restitution is owed. And so if you're of a certain skin color, you owe restitution to a people of another skin color. And the problem is this. First of all, where is the moral foundation of that? Because the argument is that simply because you exist in this color and engage in the current society, you're automatically guilty. Where's the moral foundation for that? How is that rooted in the image of God? How is that rooted in one person's action toward another? The Ten Commandments, very instructive in morality, all implicate people for what they themselves do. Nothing else. It's what they themselves do. So where's the moral foundation for that? It's not there. Second, where's the moral knowledge for this? Is this true or false? Well, again, if you're just making these things up and what you say is true, okay, fine, you can say it's true or false. But again, show me the actual foundation for right and wrong in this situation. Show me the origin of this. Show me what this is based on. Show me this is an objective moral reality. And they can't do it. They can't demonstrate that it's an objective moral reality. So you see, the problem is the morality of the other side, of the CRT, of the progressives, breaks down the second that you start assessing it in terms of objectivity and in terms of these moral facts. Again, moral freedom. Well, they simply argue you can't be anything other than racist. Okay, that denies moral freedom. See, it's fascinating. Their view of these things is completely misconstrued, and it completely breaks down when you actually look at reality. And so that's one of the reasons why this is really important to understand the Christian theistic view of morality, is because this explains not only what we believe, but why we choose to act the way we do and what we say is good and false, or good and evil. And with that, I'll go ahead and leave you there. Thank you again so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church. I look forward to seeing you next time on this, when we tackle, I believe, the first, we'll see which one it is, but I believe it is the first of these. We're going to be doing, next time we're going to be tackling moral apologetics before the 20th century. So we're going to be looking at Plato, Aristotle, early church theologians, Aquinas, Kant, Sedgwick, Sorley, James, Rationale, Taylor, a number of different guys. So we're going to be looking at the history of the moral apologetics. It's going to be a lot of fun. I hope you all have a wonderful night, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.